Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and you're watching SQL Server 2008 Administration. In this video, we'll be looking at database mail. But when we get into the overview, there's really two things: database mail, and then there's one significant component outside of SQL Server, SMTP, that we're going to spend a little time looking at because you'll need it in order to actually try out database mail. But let's jump into database mail and look at the players. Now, my bullet list is going to build from the top down, but if you look at my diagram, it's going to really be from the bottom up because store procedures are there at the very bottom. They're pretty close. Where you see exe sp underscore send underscore db mail, those are your store procedures. They're built in. They're already there. You install database mail. You get them for free. And actually, most of the stuff I show you here, if not all of it, you don't even interact with it directly. We're going to interact with it indirectly. But you want to understand what those components are. So there is a store procedure that will actually handle sending your email. Next, moving up the diagram and down the list, is mail objects. And if you look there, I have configuration and security objects on the left and messaging objects on the right. If you're at all familiar with the whole idea of object-oriented programming, the concept of creating objects, conceptual objects, that are data and the functions that operate on that data all encapsulated into one for ease of reuse is what we're talking about when we talk about software objects. And that's what we're doing here. I mean, it's used all throughout Microsoft products, but that's what we're doing here, where we have objects that are specifically oriented toward handling configuration type tasks in data, handling security type tasks in data, as well as handling the actual messaging type tasks in data. So for example, if I'm talking about messaging, some of the data associated with a message would be who you're going to send the message to, right? The email address. So that might be a property on a messaging object. You set the email address of where you're sending it. Subject could be another property or value. You set that value or property. The content of the email would be a third property or value. You set all of those, and then you would call a function, the actual send function, to send it, which would also likely be part of that object. So that's the whole idea behind objects. You can interact with them directly. Microsoft has really opened up SQL Server to developers to get in there and do this stuff, hands-on, and get in there and tweak it directly. You don't have to, and we're definitely not going to do that in this case, but I wanted you to understand what the major players are in the entire paradigm. And then there's queues. If you look there in the middle of my diagram, I have my mail queue for outgoing mail on the left, and then my status queue for incoming status on the right. So what's that all about? Well, SMTP server, which you can kind of see at the very top of the diagram, is typically on a separate box. Well, guess what? It could possibly be offline while the database is still online and trying to send email, or maybe not even offline, less severe than that. It could just be too busy or to handle additional email. What do you do in that case? Just not send it? Well, no. You can queue it up in a mail queue. Same thing with the status reports that are coming back from the SMTP server. SQL Server saves all that up in a queue as well. Now, all of that is handled inside my MSDB database. And if you've seen any of my other videos, specifically installing SQL Server, as well as some of the stuff on SQL Server Agent, we get into that quite a bit because the MSDB database is one of your system databases that SQL Server uses to manage the information about how to manage itself, so to speak. So when it's queuing up messages, or when it's scheduling jobs and notifying operators and things of that nature, it needs to know who to send it to, when to send it, etc. All that's saved in the MSDB database. That's where your queues are going to be saved. That's where all your messaging objects are going to be saved. It's in your MSDB database. And then there's the database mail 90.exe program itself. It's really just the program that runs the whole thing. Once again, you're not going to interact with those directly, but those are the players that you'll be interacting with. And then this last one, the SMTP mail server, is actually outside of SQL Server altogether, as the diagram shows. That's the server that'll actually take care of sending the email for you. So SQL Server's database mail 90 interacts with SMTP, and then SMTP takes over from there, knowing how to send an email. So it's pretty cool stuff. But here, let's talk about SMTP in a little bit more detail. Stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and it's a service provided by, here's yet another TLA, three-letter acronym, right? IIS. It's It's provided by IIS, which stands for Internet Information Server. So for those of you who've done anything with web server support or development in the Microsoft camp are probably familiar with IIS. It's Microsoft's web server application. Definitely if you've done any ASP or ASP.NET, you'll definitely know what that is, right? But it's actually a service of IIS. So you're going to first install IIS, and after installing IIS, it's basically a switch to turn on SMTP plus a few other configuration options. And then it will allow me to deliver outgoing email. So I don't have to get into the details of how do you actually send an email. What happens under the hood? Don't know, don't care. SMTP takes care of that for me. So let's jump over and actually configure our SMTP server first. Now once again, this is not a class in SMTP configuration or Windows configuration, but in order to have you be able to actually try out the database mail, we'll have to have that server. So let's jump over and do that. So go to Start, Server Manager, and if I go to Features, give it a few seconds to finish building. I want to ultimately go to Add Features so I can add SMTP, but it's still collecting data. So my screen filled in, scroll down to Add Features. Here's a list of all the additional features I can flip on if I want to. I want SMTP server, and that's it. Clicking that, it says, hey, you know you need this other stuff. Do you want to add these other required roles? Well, if they're required, yeah. So I'll go for the default here, grab that. Go next, next. Any other web server stuff I want? Nope, just need the SMTP server. That's what I want, that bare minimum. Give me an install. And then wait while the water level rises, and when it's done, we'll come back and move on. So after a brief wait, we got it all in place. Web server installed successfully. Remote server administration tools are in, and the SMTP server, the main thing we wanted to see, installation succeeded there as well. So we'll close all this down and move on. So now let's double check something. Go Start, Administrative Tools, IIS Manager. First few times was in here, couldn't get my email to go to save my life. The problem was the SMTP virtual server was not running. If I right click, notice there's a start, a stop, and a pause. Mine was stopped by default, but this one is already running, so you're good to go. But you do want to make sure that your SMTP server is actually running. Okay, so we're good to go there. So now we can move on back to the slides and continue on. So I've got my server in place. Now let's talk about my database mail profiles and my database mail accounts, the two main entities you interact with when setting up database mail on the SQL Server side. But starting with profiles, database profiles are basically a container or repository for database mail accounts. Gee, that tells you nothing, right? So, okay, so profiles are containers for accounts, but I still don't know really what either one of them are. We're getting there. But for now, just think of it as this information that we need to keep in groups or collections. Accounts are going to actually tie you to who you're sending things to. It's going to tie you to an email address. But for now, just think of profiles as a way to set generic informations for your various accounts. You can use your profiles to configure things related to the various stored procedures that we're going to be using. So it says here it allows you to reconfigure stored procedures and your database applications that'll use email. So once again, it's basically a repository for who you're going to send information to, how you're going to send it there, general stuff you'll need to set to send email. And then last, one of the things you can do with profiles is use a profile to set up everything for development, and then with a small change to the profile, move from a development and testing environment to your actual development environment. So as it says here, it can be configured with one or more email accounts during application development and then updated with a different set of accounts when the application moves to production. So you can start off with one set of accounts and then take and move that entire paradigm that we talked about before from development to production by simply changing some information in the profile. Now all that's pretty theoretical, And the best way to make sense of it is to actually do it. So we're going to do that, but before we do that, one more thing we want to touch on, and that's public versus private profiles. You do have two basic categories of them, and as you may have guessed from the names, public profiles are available to the public, right? Not rocket science here. Well, not quite that simple. If you think back to security, we talked about database roles and server roles. Public profiles are available to anyone who's been added to the fixed database role of database mail user role. It's a fixed database role in the MSDB database. So by adding anyone there, they have access to all public profiles as opposed to people who are in the sysadmin fixed server role. And just note that. That's server role at the bottom, it's a database role at the top. But if you're in that server role, you have access to the private profiles. And that's the only the only group of persons that will have access to your private profiles initially are the people who've been added to the sysadmin fixed server role. Anyone else must be granted specific access rights to those private profiles. But here, let's jump over and do it. So let's go ahead and configure our database mail. Once again, go Start. This time we're going to go into SQL Server via the Management Studio. I'm going to connect the account that has the rights to do this and as administrator right now, but anything that's part of sysadmin would be good. And if you expand the management folder, notice there's an option here that says database mail. If you right click on it, there's a configure database mail option. So we'll do that. Brings up a wizard. You can skip the screen if you'd like to never see it again, but click next. Three options here. One, set up database mail by performing the following tasks. Create my new profile. That's exactly what we want to do. Specify security. Any other system parameters. Second, manage existing accounts. We don't have any. Manage any existing profile security. We don't have any. Change any system parameters. So we want the very first one for now. Click next. Database mail features not yet available. We haven't been in here yet. Would you like to enable it? Just click yes, and it will enable it for us, so it's good to go. And now I'll give it my profile. Let's call it Profile 1. Don't need anything too complicated. Give it some description to describe that profile. And then I add accounts, because once again, a profile is nothing more than a container for SMP accounts. So I'm going to add accounts to that profile. And here's where I give more specific things, such as account name. I'll call it my operator, right? Pick something with less letters next time. Email address. What is the email address of this account? Trying to send email back to this account will fail because it doesn't receive, it only sends, right? But you do want to have some email address show up. So I'll just call this one sounds pretty redundant here. We'll go with her nickname. There we go. Ronnie at veronicas.com. Display name, the boss. This is her business, so she's the boss. This is more important here. Reply email. This is the email you want to get the messages people send back to you, so this should be a valid email address somewhere outside of SQL. So put in whatever email address you would want here for reply. You don't have to put anything in, which means it can reply. Okay? And then another real biggie is the server, the actual SMTP server. Now in my case, I'm on my SMTP server, so I can give it either the server name or I can give it the IP address. Here, let's just grab my IP address. I'll go Start, go to my command prompt. I'll just do IP config. And just by the way, if you don't have that icon there for command prompt, you can bring up the same thing by going down here and just simply doing CMD. Press enter, gives you the exact same interface, okay? If you've been in there once or twice before, it'll be there. But IP config will give me everything going on right now with IP, TCP IP. So my current IP address is simply 192.168.200.103. So you can use that right here. 192.168.200.103 identifies my current server. That's the default port. You don't need to change that. Authentication methods. You have a choice of 3. We'll cover that a little bit more in detail coming up in the slides. But for now, Windows authentication, basic authentication, and anonymous authentication. We're going to go with Windows authentication, which is usually your best option for Windows security. So with everything filled in, go ahead and click OK. And I've got my single account under my profile. Go ahead and click Next. I have a choice of making it public versus private. I'll just go ahead and make it public for now. Click Next again. There's a quick summary. Account retry attempts, I'll up that to 3. Just because in my experience, there's something that can go wrong typically that can delay anything from happening. So give it at least 3 attempts. And just when you're doing the configuration, sometimes you may not have it quite right or something. So leaving that at something a little higher than 1 is oftentimes good. How much time to delay between retries? Got it at 60 seconds. Those defaults are fine. Go ahead and click Next again. There's my final summary. A little pop-up, which is all over the place. Click Finish. Voila. Success. Click Close. And I've configured database mail. So now let's send a mail message. If I go to database mail, right click, there's a send test email option. I'll go ahead and click that. I only have one profile to choose from right now, profile 01, and I'll go ahead and send something to myself. And go with the rest of the defaults. Click Send. How many test emails have I sent so far? Only 1. If something were to go wrong, you could sit here and wait and do troubleshoot, see what it gives you, or you can click OK if it worked. We're going to bank on this one working for now. I'll go ahead and click OK. And let's just wait a little bit and see if we get an email message popping up. If after a minute or 2 you don't see an email, first thing to check is your log. I go back to my database mail folder here. There's a View Database Log option. Click on that. And I can see the results. I can see my failure right here. Mail process was started, so that's good. But my system clock isn't on, so you can't compare those. Let me turn on my clock. We need it on for this. Properties, so we can keep track of where we're at. I'll turn on my clock. You can see it's 1:53 currently on this server. And it looks like at 1:50 and 1:51 it tried to send, so it's doing it every minute like I said. Could not be sent because of the mail server failure. Cannot send, mailbox is unavailable. So let's go check our SMTP server. Start, go to IIS. It's running. Typically that's a problem if it's the problem I find. Access, authentication modes, what do we select? All I have selected is anonymous, yet we went with integrated Windows. That would cause a problem. We didn't tell it to allow Windows authentication. But the other thing, under relay, the default is only the list below can relay messages through the server. And even though the option down here says allow all computers that successfully authenticate to get through, I found that I wasn't able to get through until I told it all except the following list, and there's nothing here, and then my messages got through. But once again, that's more on the SMTP side. That's not a SQL Server configuration setting. And it looks like right off the screen there I've got success. The boss has sent me my test email. So we have successfully configured and sent email from SQL Server using database mail. So let's move back over to our slides and continue on. So we actually went on and created the accounts and sent the email, but you got to have a PowerPoint slide, right, to bring it all home. So here's the bullet points that give you a little more handle on the accounts. Once again, these are the containers for the actual email. So it contains the information used to send the actual email. You'll have one email server per account, okay? So one account is tied to one email server, so 1-to-1. And a few other things. Authentication, it's really the same song and dance, maybe a few other things added through another beat in there, right? But basically it's the same as what we've talked about in other areas when it comes to SQL Server. You've got, first of all, your Windows authentication. There is one other thing to note. Before, when we talked about Windows authentication, we were talking about the account that the user logged in as being used to authenticate them in SQL. Well, in this case, we're not dealing with the user themselves when it comes to sending the email, because really SQL Server sending the email, it's the user. So now the paradigm still applies, but now the user is SQL Server. So it says here, uses the credentials of your SQL Server Database Engine Windows Service account. If you think back to SQL Server being a collection of services that run under Windows and each have their own Windows account, that's coming into play again here, because whatever account SQL Server is assigned to run under, that's the account that will get validated by the SMTP server. So that's important to note. You'll have to make sure that server will let that service account through. Moving on to basic authentication, it's sort of like SQL Server authentication. Here you saved your user account information in the database mail application. So I'll be using whatever username and password I've specified here specifically. And then last but not least, moving on to AA, which in this case is simply anonymous authentication, right? The SMTP server does not require any authentication. When might you use that? Standard answer is not often. But you must remember that SMTP is a component of IIS. And remember, IIS is Microsoft's web server application. So let's say you're going to your favorite online bookseller, for example, and you want to just peruse the books. Do they normally force you to log in order to do that? Not typically. You are at that point an anonymous user of their data, right? So in the IIS web world, you're oftentimes allowing anonymous users to peruse your data. So in the IIS world, it's very common to use anonymous authentication in those cases. Now, the moment you want to buy something, or actually as soon as they can possibly figure out who you are so they can suggestively sell to you, right, you move from being anonymous to either basic authentication or some other type of authentication, right? But in the SMTP world and the IIS world, you do have the option of anonymous authentication. So what did we talk about? What have we covered? We talked about how to configure an SMTP server, which is oftentimes, as I said before, outside of the realm of most database administrators, but hey, you've got one more feather in your cap than the average DBA. Configuring a database mail account, we talked about that, as well as the database mail profiles. We talked a little bit about authentication and set up some of that. And as far as new terms, really, there's only two big new ones, and that was the profiles and the accounts, where, once again, the profiles were containers for the accounts, and the accounts actually handled or contained the connection and the communication information to send the email. Two other terms we threw out were SMTP and IIS, which are really outside of the SQL world. We have enough acronyms on this page, right? But simple mail transfer protocol, which is simply a service under IIS that allows you to send email, and then IIS is simply Microsoft's web server application, Internet Information Server. So you should know how to create an SMTP server. We walk through that. It's not that hard. Just got to know what buttons to push and what boxes to check and understand the ramifications of doing so, right? Second, create database mail profiles. We did that. And third, you should know how to create a database mail account. I probably should put on here then send some emails. The fourth thing, right? So with that, it brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.